All right, well, this has been a great morning so far, so I'm happy to be on this panel that's segueing us into the afternoon. It's really nice to have you all here. My name is Micir. I'm a landscape architect and a community engagement coordinator with AECOM. And myself personally, as well as AECOM more generally, we've been involved working on behalf of the city of New York and the city of Jersey City and Hoboken across the river on master plan studies, feasibility studies, design and engineering projects to get greenways and resilient waterfronts built for many, many years and hopefully many years to come. So I can say from personal experience, you know, Hunter, I heard you saying on the last panel, your goal after this summit ends is to take that amazing Greenway study that was just done in Brooklyn and move it forward, circulate that amongst electeds and city agencies to really build momentum and get these greenways built. So I can say with excitement, enthusiasm, and deep empathy for supporting you, but it's a daunting challenge. It takes an enormous amount of collaboration and communication across different agencies, technical disciplines, elected officials, advocacy groups, communities, very diverse communities, and very diverse stakeholders, all with competing needs and priorities in order to move things forward from the planning stage, defining visions, building support behind the overall visions, implementing policy changes, getting these greenways funded. And then even once everything's kind of rubber stamped and greenlit, there's an incredible amount of technical challenges and constraints that need to be navigated to move these forward, competing jurisdictions, et cetera. So I'm laying out a whole bunch of challenges, but the goal of this panel this afternoon is to acknowledge a lot of these, but also talk through each of our panelists' experiences and strategies that we've discovered for success, and to come up with takeaways that everyone in this room can use and move forward with actually helping the city get greenways built. So as we're talking, we appreciate if everyone kind of thinks through questions that any of you might have. What would help you to hear from our panelists, who I'm going to introduce in 1 second? What would help you to hear from them to help you in your work moving forward after the summit, getting greenways built in New York City? So I have with me here today, start with my immediate left, Lyndsey Scofield from the city of Jersey City. She's a senior transportation planner. We have Ryan Mapp, the Trust for Public Land, who's been the Queensway Community Outreach Coordinator. And last but certainly not least, Mike Flynn, the senior principal for the New York office of Sam Schwartz. So what we're going to do on this panel, I'm going to have each one of them start off by giving us a short presentation about their work and their experience, and then we'll open it up for discussion, and then we'll reserve the last 20 minutes or so for questions from the audience. So without further ado, Ryan, I think you are up first.
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Ryan Mapp. I'm the Community Outreach Coordinator for the Queensway with Trust for Public Land. I'm going to start by telling you who Trust for Public Land is. We're a national nonprofit that works to preserve land, build green schoolyards, and we build greenways and advocate for them across the country. Please. So, the Queensway project was conceived over 15 years ago by a bunch of community members in central and southern Queens. They came together and envisioned the abandoned LIR Rockway Beach Branch line, which has been abandoned for 60 years, as a greenway. And this greenway would run 3.5 miles. It runs through 6 different neighborhoods. If you keep scrolling down, we see a little bit about demographics. So as I said, 6 different neighborhoods. It starts in Rego Park. It goes down into Forest Hills and Glendale, then through Forest Park down to Woodhaven, Richmond Hill, and it ends in Ozone Park. So we're covering a lot of land, a lot of different communities with a lot of needs. As you can see, there are 27 schools along the proposed trail. So we do a lot of outreach with them. Just to give a little background. If you keep sliding down. So funding for this project has taken a long time and it's come in different places. Our first big funding was in 2014. We got a $400K state grant from Cuomo. This allowed us to create physical visioning, so that includes renderings. We did community design charrettes, lots of outreach work so that the community could be involved in designing and advocating for this greenway. And because of that community advocacy, if you keep sliding up, we received our first funding. These are some of the renderings, and then one more, sorry. We received our first official funding for design and build for the Met Hub. So lovely rendering of some of our outdoor education spaces in 2022. So it gives you an idea of how long these projects take to get real funding. So Mayor Eric Adams allotted an investment of $35 million into the Metropolitan Hub. This is for the design and build. It was then handed over to the New York City Economic Development Corporation, who is responsible for that design and build. And then this March, we keep scrolling. We received funding in the form of a federal grant, which was the Reconnecting Communities and Neighborhoods Grant, the RCN grant, which is, as I said, federal and is funded by the Inflation Reduction Act. So this will build out the section directly below the Met Hub that goes through Forest Park and will create safe access into Forest Park for those 4 immediate surrounding communities, and hopefully encourage more people to get into that park as well from farther away. These are 2 more sections just to give you some ideas of the different visuals we're working with, the landscapes. The clearing is on the northernmost section and the elevated is the southernmost section. So altogether, this project is estimated, depending on when you ask, to cost between $250 and $400 million. So far, we've raised $152 million to build out 2 out of 6 sections for 1 mile of land this covers. But keep in mind, the High Line at its completion was $152.3 million, and that is for 1.4 miles of land. So it gives you an idea of the typical funding situation. But it's really exciting that this money is going to Central Queens, as it has been kind of a neglected area in the boroughs for park space, especially when you get into the south, you have higher asthma rates. So moving forward, we're really focusing on getting the community-led efforts remaining solid and strong as the EDC takes over the design and build, and then we seek out funding for the remaining 4 sections. And that's all I got. This is what it currently looks like. It's really fun to walk. If you ever find yourself in Queens, feel free to email me. I'll give you the tour. Thank you.
Thank you and congratulations, Brian. I think we're gonna move next to Lyndsey. I'm also gonna give a short intro.
Hello everyone, can you hear me okay? I don't think maybe this one's.
No, it's not.
All right, is that better? Okay.
Yes.
Hi everyone, my name is Lyndsey Scofield. I'm a senior transportation planner in Jersey City. Really feel privileged to be here today speaking with you and representing the Department of Infrastructure. We have been working on greenways for a while as well. And so I'm excited to share some of our progress in how we're getting some of these done and how we're also utilizing the roadway network. So for those unfamiliar with Jersey City, across the Hudson, we are a rapidly growing city. We're about 300,015 square miles. So quite a bit smaller than New York, but very dense and incredibly diverse. So over half of our residents speak a language other than English at home. Just for to give you a sense of some of the diversity that we have. We're also very multimodal, similar to New York City, where a lot more than half of our residents are getting around using public transit, walking and biking for many of their trips. And so for us, similar to here, the greenways are in demand both from a recreation and open space perspective, but also we look at them as functioning part of our transportation network. And we envision that a lot of people are going to be using the greenways to make those connections to schools and workplaces and transit hubs. So that's something important as we're thinking about the greenway network. Next slide. over the past couple of years, what we've been trying to do is put together some master plans similar to what I heard from New York with the summit. So on the left-hand side is from our Greenway connectivity plan. We actually worked with NYU Wagner students through their capstone program, and they helped us to stitch together a lot of the visions. Some of them had only been captured by community groups and advocates. Some of them were referenced in city plans at a very, very high level. But we didn't have a really good sense of how they all came together, what the status of them was, what our priorities were going to be in terms of trying to build them out. So having it all in one place has been a really critical part of our efforts. And so you can see that the greenways themselves kind of loop around the city, largely around the waterfront, also going east-west to the north and southern portions of the city. And then on the right-hand side is our bike master plan. And that you can see the greenways are represented in yellow around the edges. But importantly, we look at a lot of the connections into the community to make sure that there's a lot of access into the greenways. And having these two maps together helps us to take advantage and leverage a lot of opportunities as they arise. Next slide, please. So a little bit of how we're getting there. I mentioned the Greenway connectivity plan. We specifically not only focused on just the greenways, but also priority corridors for making sure that every neighborhood will have access to greenways and sort of prioritizing those based on a number of factors. The second, we really leverage private development and redevelopment. A lot of the greenways do fall within redevelopment areas, and so we're able to leverage those plans to get greenways built. We are also advancing greenway specific studies. One thing we've realized with all of this infrastructure money coming out of the federal government is that we haven't been in a position to actually apply for it and have competitive grant applications because we haven't done enough of that due diligence and the planning work to know exactly what we want or have an idea of what it's going to take to build out some of these greenways. So we're doing a lot more technical feasibility studies, envisioning with the community and advancing those so that we're ready for the next rounds of capital funding. And then that leads into the prioritizing of projects and implementation. We've really thought about how we're segmenting out the different phases of the greenways and able to, whether it's leveraging the private development or grant opportunities, looking at plots of land that are city owned or other public lands, obviously makes things a lot easier. So we're kind of piecing together how we prioritize and fund those projects. Next slide, please. These are just a couple of images of greenways in various stages of completion. So this is an example of a privately built part of redevelopment. They were required to put in a portion of the Hackensack River Greenway. Right now, it doesn't connect to anything, and it's really hard to get there by walking or biking. So we take the opportunities as they come because we know we're going to be extending it north and south. So we really do try to leverage, whether it's repaving, whether it's redevelopment, we're just trying to get as much built as we can. Next slide, please. This is the Bergen Arches, really special place. It's been an abandoned rail corridor for decades. And so there's kind of an urban oasis right through the heart of Journal Square, if you're familiar with Jersey City. So on either side, really, there's skyscrapers going up, and down here, you're 40 to 70 feet below grade, and it's really peaceful. It's owned by New Jersey Transit. We were really privileged to have our advocacy groups advocate for funding at the state level to do a feasibility study, and it was actually the city that was able to oversee that study rather than New Jersey Transit, which I think was a good strategic opportunity for us to really engage with our local community. And now we're able to much better advocate for what our community wants and needs out of this project, because this is envisioned as reactivated space for transit as well as green. And then finally, just wanted to share a couple of images of our on-street bike network. So we do a lot of quick build implementation of our bikeways. Some of these do function as either interim greenway segments or also will be part of the greenways when they're built out. And there are some segments of our greenways that in the areas that we were building them out, the community, after a lot of work, we still haven't quite gotten to the point where there's support for the fully protected bike lanes. So it's going to be an iteration. We'll make some improvements, traffic calming wise on those segments until we're able to come back to those corridors and build them out with some more robust infrastructure. And we're starting to get to the point now where we're hardening this infrastructure as well. So some of these bike lanes, as funding becomes available, will become raised bike lanes, really separated from moving vehicle traffic. And that's something that's really an important part of our strategy. And that is it. So happy to answer questions after this, but looking forward to that one.
That's it. Okay. Great. Okay, hey everybody. So I'm going to build a little bit off of actually, I think a lot of what Lyndsey talked about in terms of thinking it through the full life cycle of how to get greenways built, but through a lens of on street. And, you know, streets are kind of in a way the most banal, right, infrastructure for greenways because they crisscross the whole city. By and large, the city has full control over them. And maybe some of the challenges we face are less technical, but other kinds, right? But that said, I think, you know, especially in the scale of New York, there's a lot of opportunities to get more built. So let's talk about some ideas. I think as we all know, and it's well established, but you know, New York has really set the bar for quick build projects and SIPs and cranking them out, and that's awesome. And you know, the toolbox is constantly evolving. And you know, that's great, right? And so it's sort of like how do we grow beyond that? Next slide. Because quick build is only one part of the equation, right? It's going to require more maintenance over time, potentially. It only lasts so long, then you have to rehab it. Maybe you can't do as dramatic transformations. Next slide. And you know, as I like to say, and I don't mean it to be snarky, but like, you know, Copenhagen didn't become Copenhagen with just signs, signals, and markings, right? We want to physically transform the streets and our public realm, because I think there's a psychological element for cyclists and pedestrians and other mobility users, you know, of really feeling like the infrastructure is taking care of you. Next. So yeah, you've all heard, I think, through the summit, and I will give the city accolades. You know, I think it's come a long way. I worked for the city over 10 years ago, and I think, you know, planning was a little bit secondary to just getting stuff built. And now we're seeing a lot of great plans out there. And I do think that's important, not just because I'm a planner. I think having plans on the books, it front loads a lot of the work, a lot of the community engagement, and hopefully it can help the community understand the rationale when the time comes to say, hey, you know, this has got to be the priority corridor for a bus lane or a bike lane or something else. So I think planning is important. It's just the first step. But it results in wonderful maps that all of us planners love, like these. And I'll underscore, you know, the points you made as well about not just the citywide plans, but having these corridors. So I want to also give a shout out to the Queens Waterfront Greenway. Public workshops are coming up, right? Yeah,
I've been passing around flyers,
Yeah.
Bike-tober, and yeah, we'd love to see you there. There's flyers over there and I'll make the rounds. Thank you.
yeah, sure, yeah. So, you know, a couple of Greenway plans underway here in the city, Harlem, River, Queens, and others. Next. All right, so, you know, thinking about maybe the less glamorous stuff, the good thing about having plans is now you know where your priority routes are, and you can leverage opportunities like grant funding, but also things like routine maintenance. If we're gonna go out and repave a street, why don't we improve it at the same time, right? And so if we can, so, you know, that's certainly one opportunity. Next. And another one being, you know, DOT and parks are, you know, and NYC is just one piece of all the capital projects that are happening in New York at any given time. Especially as we think about DEP, which I think is still the largest share of the Department of Design and Construction's infrastructure budget, even larger than DOT. They're putting water improvements, sewer mains, you know, all the time. So how do we harness our improvements to those? It's going to be a heck of a lot cheaper to build a greenway, an on-street greenway, when you're already ripping up the street than to come back later. So we really got to seize those opportunities because resources are limited. Next. A couple of good examples of that I'm aware of are Columbia Street, right? I think it was one of the first segments of the Brooklyn Waterfront Greenway to get built in a permanent way. And I believe that was done as part of a DEP capital project that was already in the planning. And I remember when I saw this thing pop up, like, whoa, that's a really nice on-street bikeway. Like, you don't see too many of them in New York, because this was a long time ago, it was like 20 years ago. You know, and then the rest of the Greenway was sort of connected to it over time. So let's capture those opportunities. Next. Another fun one also from a while ago, but that I just think is so cool, was Allen and Pike malls. Parks had gotten funding to widen those center malls, and DOT said, hey, we can work with you to also widen them and turn it into a sort of, I guess, like Parisian style or whatever, you know, like boulevard style bikeway. So that was the before. Next. That was the interim, right? So DOT came in and put it in the quick build version while we waited for the money and all the design and approvals for the capital. And then next. That was the, you know, the permanent version. It's lovely. It's really, if you haven't biked it, check it out. Next. And then, you know, kind of related to that, and I think this was mentioned earlier, maybe Ted mentioned it, I'm not sure, but you know, just really connecting the quick build to the capital budget, and also just generally how we're prioritizing capital investments to build out those priority networks. And that's kind of really the guts of how the city works, but we got to get in there and bring the big picture planning together with all the budgeting and year-to-year stuff. And I'd be remiss if I didn't, you know, admit that, like I said earlier, for streets, in some ways, the issues are not as technical, right? The challenges are more maybe losing parking spots or political or things like that, right? And that's challenging. I don't have an easy answer. I think Commissioner Rodriguez had amazing thoughts earlier about, you know, how we have to balance, right? In a way, the purpose of government is to work for the greater good and the citywide needs. But that doesn't mean steamrolling communities, and we have to strike a balance. But I think, you know, there is certainly a role for leadership and kind of how we work with communities collaboratively to get stuff built, but to do it in a sensitive way. And certainly we just need a lot of money, but that was discussed earlier. Thanks.
Well, thanks to each of you. I think those were all great presentations. I like that you were leaving off on your last slide with the comment about money, Mike. Because I actually wanted to start first question over to Ryan, because as you showed in your first presentation, the Charleston Public Land was successful in raising over $100 million. I think it was close to $150 million for Queensway. So can you talk a little bit about the strategies for, like, how you guys were successful in doing that? And then I'd like to kind of, once we hear from you and your thoughts on, are those strategies inherently applicable to other greenways as well? And I'd love it if the other two panelists could also weigh in on that, like how do we take some of those successful strategies and apply them elsewhere?
Good. Can you all hear me okay? Yes. Cool. The cool thing about the Queensway is that it continues to be and began as a community-led project. So Trust for Public Land kind of does the job of putting these community members and groups into the room with legislators and people who are creating policy, working in government positions, staff, etc. So we kind of function to elevate the community group, which I think is what makes this project really cool. In getting the funding, we're also very privileged in the fact that Trust for Public Land is a national organization. So we do have you know, sectors of people within the organization who work in DC, who understand federal grants and that language, which obviously is very, very helpful. I would also like to mention that the work again of the community group to get this done, these are all people with full-time jobs, they have families. They have dedicated over 15 years, the same people, it's about 15 people to this project. You know, they're not seeing any of that money. That money goes to the city for the design and build. So making sure we keep these people in the loop and keeping the communities that we're building in informed and hopefully participating in the design process, I think is really important. But that was kind of our strategy in our approach to the funding. It also really fit in well to the RCN grant from March, 117 million, that's like our big one, right? The theme of that grant application was like a divider of communities. So communities that were divided, the other awarded project was the PQE, which is also a really cool, interesting project. So Forest Park is an amazing park in Queens. For those of you who haven't been, you should definitely go. But it divides, you know, these 6 communities, and it's really hard to safely access. There are no bike lanes within the park. It's hard to access by foot. So with the city, we decided that it was a competitive grant. And we were able to prove that by the work that the community group did, which was years of community advocacy, signatures, petitions, surveys, you name it. Yeah, so that was I would say our strategy.
Okay, Mike or Lyndsey, would either of you like to add on or take it from here?
Yeah, I think, you know, we have also been trying to stitch together different opportunities and sort of elevate the community advocacy groups. You know, some of them a similar story where they've been working for well over a decade on a lot of these plans. We're also endeavoring to apply for the Reconnecting Communities grant for Greenways. So we're working right now on the Morris Canal Greenway, which has some segments have been built. I think what's great though is that it is very widely applicable. Like we have, as we look at our Greenway network, many of the greenways are going through historically disadvantaged communities that could benefit from the investments and from the connectivity and the open space. But it's been, part of it is managing the political realities. So the Bergen Arches is one that we wanted to advance forward at this point, but because of the challenges of dealing with multiple agencies and different timelines, that one we weren't able to advance for the grant opportunity. So I think it is, I think a lot of these strategies are applicable, but it's just figuring out the right timing. And you know, I think that what you said about keeping the communities engaged is so important, because it is so easy for us to get kind of into our normal routine of and process of advancing projects and forget to reach out and ask for feedback and ask for ideas at those various critical points. So yeah, I think that's what we're trying to do in Jersey City.
So actually, I'm glad you just brought up Bergen Arches again, as you were talking about it during your presentation and noting that, you know, you're trying to do this on property that's actually owned by NJ Transit. And, you know, kind of the overlap of jurisdictions there making it challenging to get funding. So how is Jersey City approaching navigating this with multiple agencies and jurisdictions? And if that's getting in the way of applying for some grant funding at one time, are there new strategies that you're putting in place to make sure that it's able to be successful for later strategies?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the good pieces of information is that because the city has really, and the advocacy community has really advocated for the Bergen Arches, it really has caused New Jersey Transit to, I think, you know, move it up in their priority list. So it wasn't quite on their radar, but as there have been opportunities through that agency with the World Cup and kind of doing some transit planning and expansion out west to the Meadowlands, there's been more interest, and it's now the Bergen Arches is getting sort of looped into these larger master plans, as well as a larger regional greenway. Right now it's just being called the Greenway, but it's called Essex Hudson Greenway. So that would be also of interest to New Jersey Transit. So basically they're looking at this in a more holistic manner so that if transit comes, it makes sense for it to be planned at a much larger scale than our piece of a greenway. And so having the feasibility study and the visioning done ahead of time I think puts us in a much better place where we know what the community groups and what the local neighborhoods are asking for out of the Greenway. And they recognize that in order for them to be successful, that they are going to need us to help with a lot of the community engagement and buy-in at the local level. And so positioning that way, I think has given us some leverage, even though we're not the property owner in that case, and not likely to become the property owner. Be routine to New Jersey Transit.
So on a kind of related note, we're talking about jurisdictions and abilities moving forward. Mike, I want to turn to you for a second. So how is the process for getting a greenway built on New York City streets and working with DOT inherently different than doing it when you're working in jurisdictions that are more the territory of NYC Parks or it's EDC capital project? You know, are there things that work that you think are really successful about that process that could be maybe carried over into other greenway initiatives, or are there things that don't really work? Like, what are the challenges and benefits that you have?
That's an interesting one. Yeah, I mean, I think like I mentioned, you know, certain things like streets are mainly under one agency's jurisdiction. Parks generally are under one agency's jurisdiction. So when you're planning sort of segments, maybe it's all well and good, right? But I think when you start to look at corridors and certainly citywide network, obviously, you're gonna need to work across jurisdictions. And it's much better to do that early on, you know, in the planning than to kind of, you know, be like, you know, knock, knock. I mean, even like a private property owner, right, along a waterfront, like we want part of the Greenway, we're gonna need their participation to get it through there. Better to get that process started early, so that, you know, you can collaborate better later. I guess maybe also another thought is that if you are gonna go after external funding, get those agencies to work together on it, so everybody's kind of within. The other advantage of that, I think, is that, you know, a lot of grant funding, your application is gonna be stronger if your project can show benefits that touch on a lot of different categories, right? So it's not just a transportation benefit. Maybe there's an environmental justice benefit, maybe there's an economic development benefit, or a resilience or sustainability benefit. And so, you know, I think having spent a decade at an agency, I know, you know, we're all each kind of in our own box sometimes, and there's an advantage to maybe coming together and sort of getting everybody's perspective on those different things, right? And that may be a more competitive grant application too. Yeah, I don't know, those are initial thoughts.
So actually your last comments there kind of bring me back to discussion that we were starting to get into during our pre-panel conversation earlier this week. Are all the greenways, are we all like in competition with each other? Like, it's, you know, everybody's talking about, you know, funding sources opening up, needing to do these grant applications. I love where you're going with, like, it's more competitive if we're working together on this, but there's so much greenway ambition in New York City and in New Jersey right now. So many different projects, different segments that are all trying to get built. Is there inherently competition between them? Are they open to different funding sources? Like, and how are we navigating that overall as all people interested in kind of building more greenways in New York City? That's to any of you, really.
I could start. I mean, I think so there's always a tension, right, in government between trying to do the rational planning, right, and also being sensitive to things that are actually happening on the ground. And maybe momentum that's already there, or even funding that's already there. And that probably will never be. So that's a little bit of like the sausage making thing, right? Is that, you know, you may have a citywide plan, but you may need to jump on some funding opportunity because it's there, it's right in front of you. That said, I think it's, you know, I would underscore the importance, and again, the city's doing this, Jersey City's done this, of having a citywide vision and plan and then setting priorities. So that to the best of your abilities, you can get in front of that and you know, and it's absolutely true what the commissioner said earlier, right? Some communities are going to be heard more than others. And it's kind of government's job, I think, to try to correct for that. So that can only really happen at the citywide level. But that said, having like soon the continuous greenway around Manhattan is like a global, gem it's priceless, and it benefits not only people who live in wealthier neighborhoods, but a whole lot of other New Yorkers and visitors. So there's no perfect science, I guess.
Also, answer a little bit from our perspective, and we've had a little bit of this experience, speaking about the Greenway going out to Montclair. The state DEP is leading that project, and there was a lot of question about where are they gonna start, what's gonna be the first phase, and so we were disappointed that it's not Jersey City, but at the same time, I think our community was very excited to just see it moving forward, and we understand, all the considerations, and I think part of it is understanding and communicating out to the broader community what factors are at play and why certain phases are moving forward. And then the other piece is that and we found it has been really helpful to have these interdisciplinary working groups. So the Hackensack River has a working group, soon to be having a more regional North Jersey Trails working group, which I think will be really useful. And I know as we're advancing certain greenways, the Bergen Arches, with that feasibility study, it wasn't just the Bergen Arches Preservation Coalition who was very interested, but also another really exciting greenway project, the embankment, which is elevated, sort of similar to the High Line, an abandoned rail corridor, but that's in litigation. And so they were recognizing that they aren't able to advance their interest in the Greenway, but they were very interested in the process and understanding, how the Bergen Arches, which will one day connect to it, what that vision will look like and what that process is. So they were building their own internal organizational capacity by getting involved in these other greenways in the city that are getting built and getting studied. So I think it behooves everyone to really work together and learn from the segments that are going forward.
Yeah, just to bounce off of that, I think, events like this and coalitions like this get greenways to the top of the pile when you're looking for funding. Because you're not just competing against each other, right? You're competing against other infrastructure projects, you're competing against flooding, you're competing against roadways, and also like for these grants, the bigger federal dollars. And I guess, yeah, it's like yes and no. It's like everyone has said, it's complicated, but I think things like this are so cool because it shows that a lot of these organizations that are working on greenways do want to come together and get to the top of that pile. And I think every year there are different grants that provide funding for different things. There will be some point that everyone's project will hopefully fit in perfectly to one of those grants. So there should be funding for all of us. Will there be?
Okay, I have one more question that I want to pose to the whole group right now, and then we're gonna take I have a great stack of audience questions ready to get into some of those. And just for everyone's awareness, we started this panel a little bit late, so we're probably gonna go to about 12:20, 12:25. Just hang tight, we'll get to lunch soon. But this is a great discussion. So as we're talking about funding, so it's something that came up on the last panel, I think Ted Wright was voicing this, is also considerations for the long-term maintenance of greenways, right? It's not just about how do we get these. Oh,
No, it's not
that interpretation, right? It's not just about how do we get them built in the first place, but how do we make them last? So to what extent in each of your experiences planning and getting these built, to what extent is the long-term maintenance of these factored into, coming up with the original budget, getting the funding for this, and all of the efforts that we're putting towards planning these out? And whoever wants to start, jump on it.
Sure. So it's definitely an area we have a lot of room for improvement on. We've certainly been guilty of advancing projects without having the solid maintenance plan figured out ahead of time, and then you're kind of dumping it on the entities that are responsible for maintenance. So that's not the nicest thing to do. Bergen Arches feasibility study that we've we're just wrapping up now is a good example of trying to get more proactive in our feasibility studies about that. So in our cost estimation of what that would take to build out, the consultant has put together a bit of a maintenance plan. So thinking about, you know, how many hours it's gonna take someone to empty the trash bins every day, twice a day, for however many days a year. And, you know, to that level, we're now including that sort of an estimate into our plans ahead of time. It's still difficult because, you know, these grant opportunities, you have a lot of capital funding to build it, but then finding the funding to actually operate and maintain and meet that budgetary need is definitely still more challenging. But yeah, just it is incredibly important part of it to at least know going into things. And we're also hopeful that some of these advocacy groups that have focused a lot on getting the Greenway built will sort of transition into some of those Friends of the Greenway type groups that will also be able to privately fundraise. We have a neighborhood association that is a little ahead of the curve. They several years ago have already funded some money for the Bergen Arches and sitting in an account because it hasn't been able to be used yet. But things like that, where hopefully between private, public philanthropy dollars, will be able to adequately maintain a lot of these spaces.
Yeah, that was awesome. I wish that maintenance was built into some of these grants, I really do, and it can be a frustrating issue, right, because not, especially on the Queensway, like, those are middle class communities, middle to lower class predominantly, with the exception of Forest Hills, I think, and so there's not like a plethora of funding around for private organizations to come in and fund like a Friends of, like you have on the High Line, or like you have in Manhattan, really in any park. So it's a little more complicated. That's where we really lean on community outreach. Forest Park Trust has a really amazing group of volunteers. They have a really great parks department out in Forest and Highland Park that also work really, really hard out there to maintain both parks, which is a lot of planning for a small administrative office. So yeah, more money to maintenance workers is huge. I don't know that I have a great answer to this question because the Queensway hasn't been built yet, so there is not an official maintenance plan, and that would be the responsibility of the city to decide on. However, we're trying to get community outreach going further to like sustain and engage people that are committed to working in the park of Queensville.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I would just underscore the 2 points, right? It's in an ideal world, the way it should work is that every time we're planning a project to build, we're also budgeting for the operations, right? But the way it works in reality, that's something every city, I think, struggles with, and it's built into a lot of the funding sources. Even like a lot of these big pots of federal money that the MTA uses can't be used for operations, right? And so it's kind of like, yeah, that's where we need help right now. So let's keep trying to improve that as we make these plans. Let's think about them both in terms of the capital dollars and the O&M operations and maintenance dollars. And then the second thing I would say is just that point about maintenance entities and partnerships, and this is obviously something. It all comes back to money, right? And the fact that if you value your public realm, you need to fund it, right? You need to fund not just ribbon cuttings, but the stuff that's less exciting for politicians, which is the maintenance. And here in New York, like a lot of places, we typically need some private maintenance partner to do anything beyond the most basic designs, and that can work fine in neighborhoods that have robust maintenance partners. It doesn't work in large swaths of the city. And I know there's been efforts over the years, like with the Plaza program and others, to kind of root up these entities that can help channel philanthropic funds or whatever, or even have wealthier parks, cross-subsidize other parks, or those kinds of things. But probably we need a bigger pie just in total for our public realm here. But.
All right, thank you all for this insightful conversation. We're going to turn it now to, we have about 15 minutes left, so we're going to open it up to some of the audience questions that I've been receiving. So the first one, goes to you, Lyndsey. How does Jersey City designate greenways? And what are policymakers thinking about connecting Jersey City to Newark, mainland Jersey, and population centers outside of the city?
Sure, so we've generally thought of greenways as being shared use paths that are largely separated from moving traffic, usually along the waterfront or these sort of separated areas along old railway corridors. We're definitely thinking about connectivity to the broader region. Some of that is happening through the regional MPO has some plans, so they've been working on active transportation plans. There's also state level work being done to envision the statewide network of trails. I mentioned before the working group with the Hackensack River waterfront. Right now that includes Hudson County as well as a few other municipalities, so Bayonne, south of us, Secaucus, north of us. And so we're sort of, prioritizing, sharing best practices and thinking about those more regional connections in terms of getting over the bridge into places like Kearney and Newark and eventually out to Montclair. The state DEP has been really envisioning one of those connections, and it's gotten a lot of political attention and funding. And so we're excited to support that. We participate in it. We've, tried to make available the opportunities for them to engage with the community. But we honestly, I think the trails working group that will be more regional in North Jersey will be a really critical step so that we are thinking more broadly, like with these grant applications, for example, so that we're smaller than New York City, but we could be partnering with Newark on a grant application to connect our cities with greenways, and we haven't yet sort of taken that step to coordinate that closely, but it's something we definitely would like to work towards, and I think the working groups are really going to be a key part of that.
Great, thank you. Our next question is, well, it's kind of for all of our panelists because we want to kind of talk about comparisons between how this works in New York City and Jersey City, but what about funding by public-private partnerships? I know you alluded to this a couple of times, Lyndsey, I think you did as well, right? So please speak to how this works in New York City and Jersey City. And on a related note, there was another question about how do we ensure that developer-built greenways function as public spaces rather than just building amenities? Yeah.
Yeah, I think there needs to be a better funding system for parks in general. But specifically with greenways, and I think it's why we see such a disparity in what gets built and what doesn't. Privately owned parks can usually be depending on who owns the land and who's in charge of the design and build. But if something's privately owned, like Little Island, it gets built a lot faster. Like that's just the reality of it because the funding is there. They can hire private people. They don't have to, share as much. I do think they still have to go through community boards, which is challenging, but or can be challenging. So great. Yeah, I think it's just really complicated, but it also allows for more funding, which is really what parks needs. I mean, we're 1% of the budget. I think that we got to move back up to one. Still less.
Half of 1%.
Okay, half of 1%. I thought that got really back up. I need to read the newspaper more. Yeah, that was what I was at that rally for. But yeah, sorry. Okay, let's stay positive. Like that's an issue, right? It prevents building, but it also prevents things like maintenance, and it prevents things like new jobs. So it prevents things like education, health. These are all tied in together as we've heard at the summit. So yeah, I think there's like the upside and the downside of public-private. I don't know if anyone has the straight answer, but curious to hear from you too.
So we also have challenges with it. We do have a section of the Hackensack River Greenway that was privately built. They, are supposed to open it dawn to dusk. There's some very sort of hostile signage that doesn't make it very clear that anyone from the public can use the walkway. And we get reports sometimes from folks in the community who say that the gates might not be opened when they're supposed to be opened. So definitely a challenge. I think that it was built a long time ago. I think we're getting a bit smarter about what sort of requirements we work into the agreements, so that we can make sure that that's not something that can happen as easily. Some other aspects of greenways that will be built by private development as they redevelop will be not held in private hands. So it will be an easement to the city will maintain the space. It'll be really open and accessible all days, all hours. So I think that's the model that we would, prefer to go towards, is just having it be more part of just like the street network or the sidewalk network. So the Morris Canal Greenway, for example, there'll be in these redevelopment areas, whole new streets being built, and this will be, a pedestrian and bicycle street, basically with park amenities that the private dollars will facilitate, but then will be more like a city right of way for the user. But yes, definitely some lessons learned from the past of these privately owned spaces and the challenges.
I feel like you're ready to jump in, so go.
I know there's a lot of questions. I'll just say, like, I'm not a land use expert, but my understanding is a lot of the privately built kind of waterfront esplanades have been more like pedestrian esplanades, right? That was design requirements rather than something that can really work as a commuter bikeway. And that, I mean, it's tough because all of this is a negotiation with the private sector and you have to have reasonable requirements, but I guess all I can say is, like, if you could have the best possible public access requirements and design requirements, a privately built and maintained, greenway is better than none at all. And so hopefully we can tweak maybe some of our waterfront zoning to learn from what's already been built.
Okay. We're gonna switch gears a little bit, and go to a new kind of topic on this. So all of you in earlier questions and during your presentation touched a bit on engagement with local communities and stakeholders. We have a few questions from the audience. I'm gonna read each of them because they all relate. The first one I think was directed specifically to you, Ryan, but I think the whole topic applies to everybody, right? Considering the rich diversity and density of Queens, how did you ensure that you effectively reached community during the planning process? We have another one that's just a general question, like, how do you engage with community members during the planning and implementation phases? And I think it's different, right? It's different during the planning phase, and it's different kind of engagement and quality of engagement during the implementation phase. Which segues to the third question, and I love it, it's deliberately being provocative. It says, let's be honest. Greenway design should be left to professionals. Isn't community input really just a stalling tactic beyond making suggestions for the greenway that reflect the specific adjacent community culturally? And I like this question, I do, because I think as any of us who have been through many different community engagement processes and trying to implement projects, greenways specifically, or any project in New York City know, community engagement can actually be a very powerful tool. It can be enormously helpful to a project. It can help drive design decision-making and implementation. But that's when it's done the right way at the right time in the process. And in other times, it can be something that's a bit of a roadblock or create some obstacles and challenges. So I would love to hear from each of you about, what are your, I don't want to say recipes for success, but I just said it. But what are some of the strategies that you've used? What helps make community engagement a helpful tool in the process versus something that is one more challenge to overcome?
Having community members on board help. The Friends of the Queensway group does a lot of support with our community engagement, and leads a lot of our community engagement. Like I said, I think especially in my role, I take more of a coordinating role, and they really lead the effort to like share and engage with their own communities. So we have people through the 6 different neighborhoods. And again, that's over the last 15 years. So it has ebbed and flowed with the project's development. Obviously, it's harder to fund community programming and stuff when you don't have funding. So the funding coming in will certainly help improve some of that programming. Trying to think what some of the questions said. But I think it's a fair point. I think community engagement is really important. Obviously, I'm biased, that's my job. But and I hear where that last question was coming from. I think I think so like that's interesting. Whoever read that in will talk to me. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think, but it's important, like you still need that input, right? And it doesn't have to be like a community board meeting where you have people screaming at you, like. You can take surveys and get signatures and, you know, use tech as we saw today, like. There are so many different ways to engage their educational programming, stuff like that, you know, just talking to people on the streets, community engagement. So I think these are all assets to building these greenways. I think the scary thing in getting funding has been, you know, relinquishing that power. It's moved from the community group to the city, which is super exciting, but you know, creating strong lines of communication is something I think we're all still learning to do. Especially as they're in the design project process right now, as I said, for the Metropolitan Hub. So making sure that community members know when the public meetings are, making sure that community members are aware of timelines, what's happening. You know, it's taken so long to get funded. A lot of people don't even know that it's still happening. Which is interesting too. So kind of just getting all that information out, and then listening too is huge.
Yeah, I would echo that. I'll start, you know, from the last question and on. I know that we're, you know, professionals, we hire consultants that are professionals in designing these spaces, but it's not just a technical exercise. It really isn't. We get so much really valuable feedback about how people want to use the space, you know, what destinations they want to access from the space, even getting sort of a temperature read on, you know, the vibe and the feel, because some people, you know, want a really active space with a lot of recreation, some want more of a respite, quiet space. And it is important to just get that understanding and kind of build that consensus to the extent possible, and figure out, you know, from the city perspective, once you get that engagement, you can start to piece together, you know, how do you now, you know, balance in all these different tensions and work that into the plan. But I do agree that the engagement piece is really, it is important. It helps us do our jobs, and it's not just purely a technical exercise to design the Greenway. In terms of reaching different audiences and, you know, it is really challenging. It's resource intensive because the best engagement is getting out there, going to where people are. And so we often find ourselves not having enough time or resources to do as good of a job of that as we want to. But, you know, some of the things we did with this recent study, you know, taking a survey and actually going door to door in a nearby business district, almost none of the people that we spoke to who have worked for a long time, lived for a long time, you know, within a 5-minute walk of the Bergen Arches, haven't really heard about it, or certainly didn't know that there was a project going on about it. So just being out there, we've tried to put up a lot of like pop-up signage that people can, you know, get a fact and a photo from, you know, maybe a piece of the Greenway that they can't see from the street level, or maybe it's on private property or whatever it is. Trying to bring those images and information out to the street where people can just pass by it and learn some more and get engaged. And then, yeah, the quality of the community process where it's not just sort of, you know, having a forum where people are yelling or, you know, just putting thoughts out there and not having the sense of conversation and community. We've really tried to have exercises at the community meetings where we're engaging one-on-one in dialogue and collecting, you know, written feedback as well as verbal feedback. Having a lot online where people can walk through a project and take it at their own pace. So those are some of the ways that we're trying to really broaden our outreach.
Okay, we have about 2 minutes left. Mike, did you want to add something quickly to the engagement question?
Well, I can hold off. I'll just say, I think like at the end of a successful engagement process, nobody's gonna be super happy, but if everybody has a grudging respect for the process and the trade-offs and the result, that's a job well done.
Love it, love it. So what we're shooting for is grudging respect. All right, we're gonna end with one last question. It's gonna be a lightning round. You each get to answer it, but we're gonna keep it brief because we have it's about a minute and 30 seconds left. So what would be like, if you had one takeaway to give to this audience, or advice for coalition members, advocates, et cetera, from this, in order to help get greenways built in New York City, get things funded and implemented, what would it be?
30 seconds. Get grant funding. That will get the ball rolling.
Collect signatures to get grant funding, letters of support, and networking. Networking is huge. That would be your work time.
And I'll say, doing the due diligence, so being in a position, getting the projects ready so that you have the information needed to actually apply for that grant funding.
All right, thank you guys so much. Wait, don't clap yet. Before I hand this back over to Hunter, before we clap for everybody, I just want to note, there was one more question that came in from the audience that was actually a question for advocates in the audience. So I didn't ask this one out loud because we'd be here all day. But I just want to throw this out there as fodder for everyone over lunch. This is a great conversation starter amongst other participants here today. So for other advocates or just any of us here today in this audience, what do you think to balance and make your advocacy for a new Greenway successful? So I'll leave that food for thought and turn it back over to you, Hunter. And well, actually, first let's clap for our panelists.